Hey guys, this is Crossing the Pacific, and obviously we haven't done a show for a bit because LPL's been on a break, but part of the things we wanted to do with the show was to talk about the LPL context related to the North American context and as well as just context in other regions in general. And one of the biggest topics in discussion right now is, of course, the North American import rule. So since owners are discussing that a lot, we have not heard a lot in terms of global context and how that affects the LPL and the LEC. So we wanted to bring multiple perspectives to talk about this. So I have Nelson, obviously, here to talk about LPL and the LPL's very storied history with the import rule. And then I have Veteran here to talk about EU, since he's been someone who's very vocal about it on Twitter in the past in relation to EU LCS as well. So I think this is a fun situation because usually I am the person that they bring onto American talk shows to talk about Europe and China, and now I am an American talk show host bringing on European and LPL experts. So this will be a fun one for sure. So thanks everyone for joining me. I think the very first thing we should talk about is the history of the import rule because it might not be clear to some newer fans. And in fact, the very first instance of import rules in League of Legends started in the LPL. Do you remember that, Nelson?
No, I don't. I thought it was
by the way. I remember that.
Okay, banger already. Okay, so in 2014, for those of you who don't know, LMQ came out all the way to NA. At that time, however, LPL teams were already importing Korean players. So you had Insect and Zero coming over to Starhorn World Club. You had players coming over to WE Academy and WE, who are both in the LPL at the time. Notable players included Ninja and Khan, who is known as either Hanbalong or Hanlabong. I always mess that up, sorry. But basically, those players came over at the time, and so LPL proactively came out and said, okay, we can't have more than 2 non-resident players per team. And the requirement would be that you would have to be playing in our league for 2 years to become a resident. So that was the very first rule, and it was actually put out by effectively Tencent. I think it was, I forget what the player, it was ACE, right? It was the Association of Chinese Esports at the time. ACE was the one who put it out, and then later when LMQ and TSM went to Worlds with Amazing Dirksen and Lustboy, Riot said, okay, we'll take this for NA and EU, and we'll add a grandfather clause for the players that already exist and are competing in our leagues. So that's the original instance. Hello?
Are we sure that was the issue and not the 5 Chinese players that came along?
No, I said LMQ and TSM both went to Worlds. So
Okay.
yeah.
So
2 of the 3 teams were basically all. The other one was all NA. It was C9, rest in peace. But in general, that was kind of the idea that Riot and a lot of people at the time said, we want to avoid StarCraft very publicly. They did this. If you read the text of the Chinese rule set, it was much more nationalistic in nature. But the same sentiment was there, for sure. So that was the original rule set. And then after that, in 2014, I will just keep going. It was actually 2015. They upgraded the rule set to be 4 years. And I'm pretty sure at this time, this was more focused on China because there were a lot of players coming in around 2015 that could have gotten basically residency who had been there since 2014. So like Insect Zero, those types of players.
Yeah, the rules in China are slightly different. It's not just 4 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they had a special clause in that one as well.
You have to be in China in person for maybe 3 out of 4 years, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So they count the number of days you are in the country, and if you fulfill those requirements, you can get residency.
Yeah, I think for NA and EU, the rule requirement was you have to be in over 50% of the games for 8 of the last 12 splits. So that ended up being around 4 years. And then in China, it was something along the lines of 48 or of the last 72 months or something like that, I think. It was
probably more than that. Probably
a lot more than that. Maybe 72 of the last something months was probably more likely. Yeah.
I mean, for NA, it's easy, right? Just get a green card.
Well, that wasn't in 2015. That 2016 was when they changed it again to be the current rule set. So they got away with they got rid of the 4-year thing, right? And now it's the way its standard form has been this way since August of 2016, which is that if you get a residency in whatever country your league is competing in, so for the NA it's the US, for EU it is Germany, for LPL it is China, and for everywhere else I'm not even going to go through a list. But the point is that if you get your residency or you become a permanent resident of that country, you can then apply to Riot Games for changing your residency status within the league. At that time, the rule set change heavily favored North American owners wanting to import. And we can talk a little bit about that. You guys probably both know the residency requirements for your respective regions, I'm sure.
Close to impossible, but
yeah. For China, it is close to impossible, right? Doinby managed to achieve it by basically never going home and marrying a Chinese citizen and also winning worlds. I think we're all parts of the process that allowed him to become a resident.
No, as in like his resident is like only in League of Legends terms. His passport stuff like that is still Korean. So
okay. So he hasn't even achieved actual residency status. Okay.
Yep.
And then I think for Germany, do you know the requirement?
I assume you have it right there. The thing about European residency requirements is we very rarely even have to look it up because most Koreans have treated Europe as like a midway point between here and North America or here and back to Korea for a better team. So we actually haven't really run the risk of having actual residents for a long time. Like the last one will probably be Wadden, and he went back to Korea the moment that he could. So we're not really we didn't have, like, for example, when the green card thing came in for you guys, Jensen was already starting to look at getting green card, right? BL was already starting to look at getting green card. We never really had that particular kind of situation in Europe, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, we can go on about that after.
Yeah, part of the reasoning is that in Germany, most cases, if you're not an EU citizen, the requirement is at least 5 years living there, right? So you have to be living there at least 5 years before you can apply for permanent residency status in Germany. I don't know the full details of it. I just know that that's the minimum requirement. In the US, it's a very fun situation. It can be as little as less than a year from starting the process to finishing it to like 4 to 5 years. So it can the process can heavily favor teams wanting to have imports in North America. We already, as you said, even before the rule rolled out, we had players applying for green cards. I remember there being a big Reddit post about both 100 Thieves and C9 having put classified ads in the paper. And the reason for League of Legends players. And part of the reasoning for that is that you have to demonstrate proof that there aren't US citizens who can fill the role in order to get them in employment-based visa. And there are a bunch of different levels of employment-based visa. One of them is, like, basically, I think, extreme achievement or something, which includes, like, winning the Olympics. I don't know if one day they could petition to change that to winning World Championship, to be included, right?
Or winning the LCS.
Yeah,
I think.
Or winning the LCS.
Achievement, okay? Very clear on
that. But one of the clauses that I found, you could either do something really, really impressive like that, or you could fill like 3 of a list of requirements, and one of them was demonstrating that you have a higher salary relative to your peers. So if your organization wants to get you a green card, they can just pay you more. So that's one of the ways that you can get a green card. But
I mean, usually that happens anyways, because if you're a European player, like you have European hands, but any residency, then you're gonna get more money. So
yeah, I mean, we actually use that terminology that European players have better hands just because they're European. So yeah, we do use that terminology and that logic, which is part of why European contracts end up being very, very inflated.
I mean, it's also not like you guys are bringing in, ever since I guess Santorin, not like you guys are just bringing in players who are like fresh from solo queue, you know,
Yeah.
and stuff like this outside of maybe Jensen, right? But Jensen was basically a superstar brand. His story as incarnation of how he was getting unbanned and stuff was really widely known. Every single player you guys have imported has had some form of brand value, right? So obviously they're going to be more expensive anyway. But I do think the fact that they're incentivized to be expensive, at least over the average rate, and thus the average rate will constantly be going up specifically to get them green cards, is actually very interesting and not something people really talk about a lot.
Yeah, I think the big part of this for me that we just mentioned is we do, teams in general do offer players in solo queue or players on National League ERL teams to come to NA, but a lot of them think it's just not worth it relative to staying and competing in ERLs, right? So there will be a mixed bag there, but there's definitely a little bit of that. And I'm assuming that these players are not getting the huge offers that the more accomplished players are getting. So that's why it's like, okay, if the monetary offer isn't extreme, I'd rather stay here and just get better at the game.
I mean, I know that some of the monetary offers actually seem rather juicy, that ERL players have rejected, but also the ERL players that are being offered, it's not like they don't have a pre-existing brand. For example, if you're one of these organizations, you're definitely going to look at Spanish scene players, for example, and Spanish scene players have massive fan bases, really aggressive fan bases behind them. They often come in fully built with a brand, and as FlyQuest recently showed, you guys are very willing to cater to a Spanish-speaking audience, obviously because of the LATAM stuff. But Spanish-speaking players do help you with that audience. So it's not like when they go to ERLs, they're just thinking in terms of hands. There's still a massive branding thing to consider that ups the value of these players.
Yep. I agree. I think that in general, like even just talking about some of these niche audiences that you can cater toward in North America or in any team is pretty huge. I know in China, obviously, you guys have your own built-in audiences, but there are still sort of sectors of that. So in general, I'm sure that there are, like you all often see in Chinese teams, there will be advertisements that are particularly catered to a specific province, or like talking about having a player visit his hometown and doing content around that. So there's still that, but they have very little reason to care about the Western fan base or various different Western fan bases.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. Like, it depends what your organization does. Like, if it's just purely like a gaming org, then of course, it doesn't matter that much. But if it's like a huge brand, so maybe I'll say like Bilibili, BLG, or TS, or like LNG. So basically, there are huge brands behind them. Then basically like the other audiences is kind of an important thing, because I think good example is like SOFM, because basically like he basically has the entire country worth of fans. And he basically has like the second biggest server in League of Legends.
And obviously and obviously Vietnam is kind of a specific case because their server, like I don't think people realize how big the Vietnamese server is.
It's like 3 million alone, though. Like one count.
From what I know, it's the second biggest behind China.
Yeah.
Fucking hell.
So yeah, I think that's a particular case. So yeah, if you can corner that entire market, then that's obviously an incentive. So I agree. It's not that isn't a consideration. It's just less of consideration for them to, like, say, people have talked about maybe if they import Froggen. If they're importing like Froggen or Reckless, right, their main concern would actually just be the Chinese fans of Reckless and Froggen, right, rather than getting Western fans. So
yeah, like we're talking about, like when we've talked about importing Western players into China outside of that disputed screenshot people were throwing around last year about a certain someone going to IG. It's generally being players who
that was fake.
Yeah, that was fake, but I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. I mean, that he's going to be DMing both of you after this. The players we're talking about are players that literally challenged WE at their peak, right? Like Reckless did really well versus them at IPL 5. Froggen did really well versus them with CLG-EU, right? These are players who are known to Chinese fan bases that China was talking about importing, right? It's not people who've never had contact with China outside of like the Odd Worlds thing recently, where in recent times you wouldn't really think of them as like a massive deal outside of maybe Perk. right? Perks is probably the one that you'd be thinking about as someone who actually challenged them, because he actually did beat WE when WE was peaking in 2017. So there's actually a reason there. But outside of that, because of the disparity in the recent 2 years that I will say exists between China, Europe, slightly tending towards China's side, you're not going to see that much in terms of a fan base in China for European players, and which is why the ones that we talk about importing predominantly are from the older strata who were challenging them when they were the best of the best.
So yeah, I think that is always a consideration that goes under as to why NA is interested in importing certain players, is also thinking about those fan bases. But I do also think that that diving back a little bit more into the history of importing, we had in 2014, 2015, both EU and LPL were very similar in terms of the appetite for Korean players to the way kind of NA still is. Obviously, I think we're much more interested in importing EU players now because of a lot of issues with language barriers and cultural crossovers not working out as much. But in general, I would say that the three regions were much more aligned, and we just need to get Korean players at that time. So I'm kind of curious as to, like, obviously both of you were kind of experienced working in those scenes at that time or near those scenes at that time, and could provide a little bit more context.
I mean, at least for China, it doesn't matter where you're from. And back then, of course, it was basically like Korea was the best region. So obviously you have to import from there, because they didn't, like, the region didn't think, or at least China didn't think that they were weaker than any other region, or at least they were like on par with the other regions, except Korea. So Korea would be like the only option, and at least for right now, so in 2020, 2021, it doesn't matter what region you are from, as long as you are better than our players, there's a chance for you to come to China.
I remember in 2014, 2015, one of the more underrated elements of it was also the streaming companies were interested in having Korean players stream towards the Chinese fan bases. Yeah. Since then, that is a little bit less of a thing, but that's why you had really, really huge salary discrepancies. I remember, like, Mata was complaining about his being taxed on his $1 million salary, and he had a Chinese jungler teammate who was not even making 1K a month USD. So yeah, it was a really interesting time, because a lot of that money just came from the streaming incentives that ended up not panning out, and then the streaming market imploded for a variety of reasons, relative to how it is now, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, like right now it's kind of different. So
yeah,
basically the orgs they all have like huge companies behind them, or the people who own the org, they have like huge businesses behind them. So it doesn't really matter right now, the streaming money.
It's also way less kind of the environment it used to be, where it was like, okay, owners are using their LPL teams kind of as toys. That happens way less now. Even IGN Wong Sitsong actually is concerned with profit, right? So a lot of those incentives are different now. I think, let's see, EU is also really interesting then, if you want to talk about it, Veteran, some of the reasons why EU teams
Some of the reasons why, what specifically?
EU teams were importing around like 2014 to 2016.
Well, in 2015, EU teams were importing because they legitimately believed that it would be the best. So Fnatic were the really famous one, right? They imported legitimately believing that the best thing that they could do at that point was just find the highest rated players on. Because I've literally talked to their manager at the time about this. They literally just figured that if they find the highest ranked, unpaid, like unsalaried, unorgless player on the Korean ladder, that would be the best option that they could do, because they couldn't agree on European players at the time. If European players know each other, they probably don't have the highest opinion of each other. They all think that they're better than the other one. So at that time, when players were still, like, the animals were still running the zoo, it was very easy to be left in a position where we don't really know what we want. We just don't want all of this, right? And then imports become the thing that you go for. At the same time, there were a bunch of agents who were coming in, like Joyluck, for example, is one that everyone will have heard of. All of these kinds of guys were going in and was literally saying stuff like, all right, I have your 2 Koreans here, I have your 2 Koreans here, blah, blah, blah. That didn't always work out. The story that I always bring up is when Vitality took them at their word for it, that these guys could be their shot calling nexus, where the phrase Korean brain was always thrown around by these agents, by the way. Like they'd always message me this stuff and I'd cringe every time. The Vitality story is always the funny one that I like to bring up. Because they accepted all of this, picked the guy up at the airport and discovered he didn't speak a word of English. So these agents were going around really abusing the lack of knowledge of what they were getting from that scene. All they knew is that at the time, like Nelson points out, Korea was the best and considered the best by absolutely everyone. But people these days don't quite understand what we mean by that. Back then, it wasn't even a close thing. Right? It would be a massive deal if you took one game from a Korean team in a best of 5. It would be a gigantic deal. You'd be at the front page of Reddit being talked about for weeks and weeks and weeks. The kind of image that Korea had in the heads of players was ridiculous. If you just had a Korean, that was it, right? Is the equivalent of saying European mid at the time if you were in North America. Just a Korean of any sort was already a big deal. So it was actually a pretty safe investment from teams from a branding perspective as well. So a combination of all of this led to the initial influx of Koreans. But we weren't like North America. We couldn't really splash out. We were just going for allless Koreans, and the brand name of just being a Korean was kind of enough. Once America got in on the game, there was no way that we could compete with them and that we could keep them, right? So I talked a lot recently about how there was like a market failure in Europe at about the time that franchising came in, and that this was a reason why we weren't able to just mass import and why you saw a massive influx of rookie players. The big thing is that even though, yes, we weren't really making that much money, America was still getting a lot of investment in. And because of that, we just simply could not compete with America, which is also the reason why we weren't really keeping a lot of Koreans before, unless Americans suddenly got a high demand from them. So you had players like Profit, for example, and Wadid, who were constantly on more lower tier teams. Once they were on a higher tier team and they had like a Worlds appearance, then they had brand recognition. Then America immediately took like Wadid over. He was on like FlyQuest or something, right? Like I didn't really follow his North American trajectory at the time, but that's when they started doing it. Players like Profit, who never ever got that high, and in fact his team only got that high when he was fucking booted for Finn, never really made that transition. They just ended up swinging back to Korea, right? But either way, we couldn't really compete with other regions that wanted to import. If Chinese team wanted to import, they would get him. If Korean team wanted them back, they would get them. If the North American team wanted them, they would get them. Consequently, Europe just ends up cycling rookies over and over again, which is good. But if we ever actually got the money, I don't see any reason why we wouldn't be in a similar situation to what North America is now. Just the fact of the matter is that we don't have that money. A lot of our money and a lot of our ad space and sponsorships are tied up in language-specific broadcasts, like the Spanish league, like the French league, that is pulling in numbers like 50k, 60k, 70k right now, easily at peak on broadcast, going up to like 150k right now. Like we're in those kinds of language broadcasts. So consequently, our players are going to have value anyway, but you're not going to really look at an import and think that they're going to be worth the money as much as you will in a place like North America, right? So a bunch of these factors why Europe's kind of in a really interesting situation. The existence of these language specific streams is why we have our like regional underbelly that is also developing rookie talent. But the fact that the rookie talent is good is kind of incidental as to why we don't import so much. It's lucky for us that our regional talent is good. But for example, if North America was poor and Europe was really rich, we probably would be importing a lot, and North America would be going into their rookie base a lot, and because of that would probably create more of a rookie scene in North America than there is right now. But it would be incidental, like the chicken before the egg sort of thing, if like the North American talent base was actually really good or not. And that's my spiel.
And we're seeing a lot of that this year too, in terms of North American, like the bottom tier teams are being forced to kind of promote players in some cases before they're ready, because Golden Guardians actually just can't afford academy player buyouts. So that's why they have players like Niles and Iconic that they just brought from CLOL and haven't gone through any kind of development process. But that development process, I think, is a good segue to talk about kind of how the different developmental scenes look in LPL and LEC, because I think LPL is a really interesting one, since a lot of people in their minds, they don't really think of LPL as not having money and being forced to develop players. So I'm curious to hear what Nelson's thoughts are on that topic.
Yeah, like what Veteran said just now about how like why did AU have so many rookies? I think that situation happened in China as well. Just for the teams which had lesser money. So basically, China had like the best of both worlds. Like they had the NA money or more than the NA money, and the lower tier teams which didn't want to spend the money, they develop players. Especially when franchising is here, they just develop players, and of course, there's like the academy system is like slightly different here. So I mean, I'm not super sure, but basically, like how it works is like every team per year you have like basically you have 2 slots where you can register a new solo queue player, a fresh solo queue player, and then he can play in LPR or LDL. Otherwise, like if you have any other player fresh from solo queue, he has to go through what's it called, the scouting grounds for China,
Yep.
and he has to play in the LDL for like 1 year before he can even start in LPL.
Yep.
So every year you only have 2 exceptions.
Yeah. So you have basically
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and this like forces you to like develop the players in academy.
Yeah. It creates like kind of a protection around. And recently, I don't know how many people saw the statement from Teacher Ma about W.E. Shanks as to kind of why Shanks was not able to start, even though Teacher Ma was allegedly going through health problems. And obviously, this is still a PR statement made by the players in the team, but just the sentiment of we wanted to protect Shanks from not forcing him into LPL too early, so I kept playing anyway. These kinds of comments, I think, are things that you see way more often in the LPL just because of some of the developmental rule sets that they end up putting in place. So this idea that I hear echoed a lot by kind of NA commentators and pundits that there isn't this concept of this player isn't ready in LPL and LCK, I think is just demonstrably false if you actually do research.
Yeah, I mean, if he's not ready, he just plays in academy.
Yep.
And I would just like to ask, and this will like segue into like what I'm gonna say next. Like, how does like EU and NA handle like their transfer windows? So basically, when you can sign players, you can register new players. Like what's the thought process behind?
So for a really long time, we didn't have like a transfer window, right? Exactly. We have off season, which starts on
it's the same thing.
On a specific date, but before then, obviously, like all the transfers are already negotiated. It's very similar, right? So the transfers are mostly already negotiated, and then there's a period where you sign all of the contracts. And then in the off season, you're kind of allowed to sign free agent players, but there are specific windows where you can transfer players between teams, which is not in the LPL as far as I know. But there is a window like through the season and during competition where you can still make player trades. So
I think more specifically, like what I wanted to ask was like regarding like youth players, younger players.
Oh, okay. Yeah. There's not really a specific regulation for youth or younger players. If you want to sign a rookie to Academy or LCS or whatever, or amateur, you can, as long as that player agrees to sign. They're kind of Riot were forced to implement regulations that don't let organizations sign players under 15 now to like amateur development programs because some teams were looking at 13-year-olds. But other than that, it's also in amateur now because in NA we now have amateur, then academy, then LCS. In amateur now, you can't sign a player to an LCS organization for more than a year, without also signing them to academy before the end of it. So basically, if you keep them in amateur, you have to release their contract at the end of the year. But that's the only regulation. Yeah.
At least, I mean, like the main thing I wanted to get at was that because I was involved in quite a few like transfer windows, so probably like 3 to 5 transfer like free agent periods off season periods in China, and basically how it goes is if there is a player anywhere, so like for example this year I think it was Shadow. Yeah, it was Shadow. So basically how it's gonna go is and in LNG back then we already had Tarzan, so but we still had to like talk about or think about like, hey, can we get this guy? We can just put him in academy for a year. It's like, so basically, like, the management or like even the coaches from the first team, they spend time to help the academy and think whether you can like sign better younger players, of course, because age is just like a really important thing in China.
Yeah. In LPL, like people focus on the age way more, I think, than even in LEC or NA. But I think so. Usually, if you're just talking about the process, and I can let you answer that comment afterwards.
No. I mean age. Like, I mean, if you're going to talk about age, I mean age matters, but it's not because that age like affects your mechanics. I mean, I don't think that's true. It's just because the older you get, the more you have more distractions, and the more distractions you have, the worse your hands are gonna be. So why don't we just ignore that issue and just get someone younger? So.
I mean, it's not always true, especially if you're starting gaming later. But I think also in LPL you have, like, I don't know. Do you know Tony Top?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah,
I know who he is.
Yeah, I know who he is. He was he went to the EG training camps, and he was like just around 13-year-olds. And I talked to him, and he said, I felt too old already when I was 18. So there is kind of that feeling where you're also looking at these players at a way younger age too. So, and if they're gaming at a younger age or they start gaming at a younger age, but if you're starting gaming at like 20, God help you in China, right? So, like, it's already doomed, I think.
Yeah, because it's just the mindset is like the older you get, 24, 25, you just want to do something else other than playing League 24/7. So.
Which isn't always true, but yeah.
It isn't always true, but it's true most of the time. You can say that.
I think also in China you have a huge population server, so there is always someone younger, right? So
yeah.
In some sense, like, I would still consider it a lazy criteria, but you can afford to be lazy, whereas in NA you cannot. I think you cannot afford to be lazy like that. I think the other thing about, but what I was going to say, just in terms of the process, usually what happens in off seasons is like not every LCS team has like a good scouting process, but say the ones that do, it's all hands on deck for a period of time to build the LCS roster first, and then you talk about academy. But usually by that time, it's like there's very little time left, and it's kind of the academy coach and the GM being like, okay, so what do we do? So I think that there's less focus on how building a very good academy rosters compared to what you just explained in LCS from the teams whose processes that I'm aware of, at least. Yeah. And then, is there anything in LEC, do you think that's different from what we've said about NA or LPL? Better?
I mean, when you guys are talking about ages, I was thinking about like how there are multiple 16 to 17-year-olds in Europe that are essentially secured under academy teams, so that they can be used the moment that they turn of age for LEC, because the ages in which you can play in the ERLs is actually different. Another big thing in terms of how you interact with ERLs and the main leagues in terms of like the transfer window and stuff is transfer window rules still apply as far as I know, but also they specifically got a number of ERLs on the Riot Games database now so that they can't be poached. But that wasn't always the case. So discussions were actually often happening before that. Though to say discussions don't happen now would be a complete lie. I think everyone knows that. Everyone circumvents the poaching. I think everyone knows that.
Yeah.
But yeah, one thing that exists in Europe that I think is really different in Europe when you're thinking about off seasons, and especially when you're thinking about structuring academy rosters, because academy rosters are generally used to hold players that you would want to be using in your main team, whereas this might still be possible in North America across the board. It's not actually entirely possible in Europe, because the ERLs, where you hold the academy teams, you have to have a certain number of players from the region itself within there. So you have to have like a certain amount of French residents, for example, if you're in the French league. You have to have a certain amount of Spanish residents if you're in the Spanish league. So if the player that you want to hold there isn't you can't have him and have the amount of residents that you need, it gets a bit tricky at that point. And so then you end up having rosters pivoting over really stupid technicalities on who is and isn't an LTR. Some interesting stuff on that is that, for example, if you are playing for Schalke in the LEC and then you were dropped down to the ERL, you count as a German resident because Schalke's academy team was in the German league, right? So you are actually more likely to then end up playing in the German league than you are in the French league, right? Or the UK league. So what if you're one of the orgs that has their academy team in French league or UK league? Initially, every org actually wanted to be in the German league, I remember, when the applications were initially being made. But they made it so that you could only really have 2 academy teams per league. So everyone got kind of arbitrarily thrown out. But this creates a really interesting dynamic in these off-season rushes. I personally hate that region cap within the leagues themselves, because now this is where I completely divulge from like the import rule on the broader scale. The fact that the ERLs are so intrinsic to the development of players themselves within Europe for a homogenous European league means it doesn't make that much sense to me that we would limit players between nations within Europe itself. Like, I don't actually agree with the import rule when it comes to the ERL level, though I do agree with the import rule when it comes to the global level, right? But that's because it should theoretically be funneling up, though they make every effort to make sure that it wouldn't be a straight one-to-one in terms of funneling up, like getting rid of relegations, etc. But yeah, as a result, this interesting dynamic I don't really think should exist in the first place. And I think it just kind of like hurts the region in the long run. So that's all the tangentials I was able to make from the conversation you guys were giving.
So I think it's interesting that you say that about how you think it shouldn't exist, because I feel like that kind of region locking and that kind of geographic fan base is the reason why Europe has a developmental space in the first place, right? So if you had a Spanish league that didn't require a certain amount of Spanish resident players, you wouldn't have the huge Spanish fan base necessarily following those players, providing the sponsorship that allows the national league to exist.
That's the thinking behind it. The reality of the situation is that the thing that made the German league really popular wasn't the German players. The thing that made the German league really popular was the German cast, right? Which is a Spandau Inferno, a very popular online show in Germany, right? The thing that made the Spanish scene so popular was less the existence of Spanish players who are good in interviews. I mean, you've seen players in interviews, okay? Like these guys aren't good. The thing that made them really good was it was the presence of people like Ibe, who are now immensely massive, towering figures in his own right? And Esports Monaicos in general, and all of these like specific to region kind of communities based around league, but not necessarily the player base within it. So I don't think it would hurt them that much. That being said, I do think that those organizations themselves would push for region locking for the same reason that you're saying. But I'm far more interested in what would be better for the development of players in Europe for a strong European competitive region than I am in the profits of the main broadcasters there. So I personally don't give a shit if they would prefer to have them locked in for that reason. I personally don't give a shit if the big organizations in North America want it removed for a similar reason, right? So
I guess, like, to an extent, that situation is specific because everyone plays on EUS anyway, right? So it doesn't really matter where you're coming from, as long as you're kind of able to demonstrate on the EUS server, which is where you mainly are drawing talent from.
Yeah.
Whereas
including Turkish and Russian talent. Which I think should be allowed, because one thing that happened recently was like the Oceanic players were arbitrarily thrown into North America, right? And I think if you're going to do that, why not allow Europe full access to the Turkish and Russian players as well? Like, if we can get them the visas, just let them be in as like a normal resident, and then I think that would be the best thing possible, because those guys predominantly play on the European West server as well. It's not the Russian server that's determining the best players in the Russian league, and it's not the Turkish server that's determining the best players in the Turkish league. And the server itself is, for me, the most important aspect of all of this representation, rather than any sort of other arbitrary line there.
You can also kind of make this argument about it's kind of weird too, though, because you can also kind of make this argument about like the Korean server in LPL LCK, right? because it's like everyone technically can play on it. I know that there were some attempts to regulate that a lot more for Chinese players being able to just play
Yes.
on the LCK server. So I think that that's an interesting question. Is that something that you've thought about, Nelson?
Yeah, I mean, it's like slightly different, at least, for Korea and US, because US is basically like, LEC and the other minor regions, but for Korean servers, like the 2 or the 3 major regions all in one server, so it's like slightly different. But at least what I think, I just feel like if the import rule is gonna change, I feel like it should at least be lifted, or I think it should be lifted for all the like minor regions, so like PCS, Vietnam. I just feel like they shouldn't be counted as imports if they go to a major region. Just to like make their scene like more alive, or you could say that.
More alive. I mean, yeah,
I mean,
obviously you come from like
like some of the scenes are like close to not being alive, like the PCS.
yeah, obviously you're also from Singapore, right? And you've worked in PCS and, well, not when it was PCS, but like LMS, and
RIP.
yeah. So, you also have a little bit of that perspective in terms of, like, if you don't necessarily even have a strong, like, I've heard people say terrible things about Garena my entire career, So in terms of like the operation of that server, having strong competition, a lot of your players want to play on the LCK server anyway, or the Korean server anyway, I should say. So, and then some players even try to play on the Chinese server, things along those lines. So I think that's where it gets kind of interesting, because I always talk about like NA domestic players as being players who can play on the NA server. So over the years, we've had some like Latin American players like Jose Diodo, who climb very, very high on the North American server, or you have players who actually come from OS and physically play on the NA server in off-season, but they don't obviously play there normally. So that's why you created this really weird situation when OS became part of NA, because like we're taking the top of the OS talent and bringing them over to NA, either as part of collegiate teams or academy teams or LCS teams, and then now the OS server is just dead, So it's not really even a talent pipeline anymore to an extent. Obviously that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but it still feels that way for a lot of players who are maybe young in Oceania and want to get noticed by teams in the future. So I don't know, it's very awkward.
I don't think it should matter that much, because like there's still like a league or tournaments and those, and if you perform well there, then obviously like teams in NA are going to pick you up, because
you'd think so.
there's like what?
You'd think so, but continue.
Yeah, I mean, if they make it into like MSI or to Worlds, then of course
Yeah.
there's still like a pathway to NA. Like there is always a pathway to NA.
Yeah, but that's also kind of a weird situation too, where it's like, oh, we're getting rid of OPL, but JK, there will still be tournaments and still be a way to get to MSI. But oh, they're also NA residents now. So this whole situation just feels kind of a mess. So like a situation where I've heard that there are other minor regions that may be having some issues in terms of stability. So if it ends up being a situation where you have other minor region leagues just dissolving, then assigning those minor regions to one region seems really weird to me, or to one major region seems really weird to me, rather than just kind of letting them have free status, if anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think they should just have free status, and I think teams shouldn't be, or the audience shouldn't be afraid of having a team of like 5 Oceanic players in NA, because you already know that they cannot win like Worlds or LCS, So I think it's fine, and if they can, then of course that's good for them. But it's unlikely for them to win, and it's the same for the other minor regions as well, especially like the minor regions which aren't doing that well in terms of like player base, like average salary, stuff like that.
It's definitely a complicated issue though, because you also see how the LCS team owners started to react to Oceanic players, right? Basically, it was only Golden Guardians and Equifax, so basically Nick Smith, importing Oceanic players at first, So he brought over Lost and FBI. And then now, like, those players start to do well, and everyone in NA thinks of it as like the cool new thing that you can do. So even before the import restriction was gone, they were doing that in Academy a lot. So I think it's just kind of, again, like a symptom almost of that sort of laziness, though, where it's like, oh, okay, we can get this player. And I feel like there are some Oceanic players who are doing very well and are competitive in Academy, but then some of them were kind of put in as like a just try over some of the other NA players who maybe would have gotten the spot otherwise, just because they were hosts. So there's still like a little bit of laziness there that I think is less likely to happen on a consolidated server, right? That's why
I Nelson first, go on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fine. It's just they just probably want to try something new instead of like recycling the old players over and over again.
If they have recycled,
or they just don't want to let Golden Guardians corner the oceanic refugee market.
Exactly.
Like, I don't really think it's laziness when people talk about it like this. Like, it's laziness from one perspective if you think that the idea that these organizations have at a top level is let's grab the best players possible. What they think of as the best players is not the same thing that most people think of as the best players. What they think of is probably the best way to open up new markets, new sponsorships, more ad revenue. That's always going to be the best thing they can do. And if you're Golden Guardians, you're not going to outbid TSM for Huni, right? And you're going to outbid them for Sword Art. You are going to grab Oceanic players before everyone else gets it, though, and that's your own market there.
I would agree with you if the Oceanic market weren't. I had money right now, for esports. But in general, I can see the argument. Yeah, I think that there's definitely
but what else are you going to do at that point, right? Like bank on the North American market that you already have access to, or are you going to try to open up the market that you have none to, right? And then other teams do that as well when they see that there's at least some money to be made that they aren't already making, and then that will probably calm down at some point as well, right? But if you can't afford the big boys.
When you're talking about Golden Guardians specifically, right? Like, if you talk to NA players in Academy who are strong prospects, like really strong rookies, they don't necessarily want to join Golden Guardians, right? They can probably get a spot on a mid-tier LCS team or even at like a really good Academy team, and then win Academy and hopefully and try to get like a spot on a mid-tier LCS team.
Again, that's the North American players' opinion.
The
reality of the situation, the also give a flying fuck if the North American players want to join them or not. They are an afterthought.
You're not letting me finish my comment. But the thing is that if you're Golden Guardians, you aren't competing for those players, right? You're not competing for those players, whereas you get a free corner market on like whatever good players exist in Turkish League or OPL.
Yeah, because at least in NA, from what I know, because I talked to some coaches in NA, and basically, like, if you're on the low tier teams or you don't have Peter Dunn on your team, then you just even the players, they don't want to join your academy team. They would rather go on like C9 Academy, or or somewhere else, or EG Academy instead.
Yeah.
Yep. C9 Academy. I mean 100 Thieves Academy has a good reputation now as well.
Yeah. So. They would rather go to C9 Academy instead of playing for the CLG together with Broxa. So.
Yep. Yeah, I mean,
those are the choices which the players are making right
now. I know at least like one of the rookies that was really kind of considered high value in the off season basically told the organization, if CLG and INT want to talk to me, just don't tell me, like I'd rather not know. Yep. I don't care. So yeah.
And he joined.
He joined a team.
An academy team. He joined an academy team. He joined an academy.
But
or probably like top 3 right now.
He's actually not on an academy team, but it doesn't matter. We won't say which player it is. I think but in general, like this is also something that a lot of teams are considering, right? It's like, what markets can I actually get players from? What markets can I compete in to get players? And so maybe these minor regions are like something that they can look at. But I think this is the core of it is what we've kind of gotten to, is especially in NA, you're not always just hiring players because you think they're the best. And that's also when we talk about the import discussion now. They're not necessarily saying that they only want imports because they want to win worlds. Like, that argument I think is kind of weird. You already saw a lot of NA players come out very publicly against this idea. Like, you bring Demon over to NA, they play on 70 ping for a year, and good luck playing against LPL teams, top LPL teams at Worlds that year. You know?
I mean, it's obviously smoke and mirrors. Yeah.
So, but this
Like,
argument
it's obviously bullshit.
I mean, this argument
that's what PCS has been playing with for the last 5 years. You know,
Mhm.
5 to 10 years. PCS has been on like 70 ping, 80 ping.
Yeah. PCS is in a fun spot right now, for sure. I'm sure you know way more about that, but yeah. I mean,
the notion of go on.
I was just going to say, but LCS in solo queue, you play on like 60, 70 ping, basically. If you're based in LA, that was what the comment was referring to. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean the notion that the organizations even care about success at Worlds as a priority is kind of ludicrous, right? Like Nelson mentioned earlier that he talked to a lot of coaches in the scene. But the fact of the matter is that pretty much only Peter Dunn out of all of them is going to have, because he isn't really in the coaching position anyway, is going to have the kind of power to actually significantly impact roster building. In North America, that's the genesis of where the GM role as the roster builder arrived. And do you think organizations took the roster building power away from coaches for the sake of competitivity? Fuck knows, because the GMs are specifically going to look at non-competitive aspects on players when they hire and fire. Like the North American scene has structurally moved away from competitivity as its core focus very visibly for years. So yeah, I think it's going to be really obvious to a lot of people when these owners are bullshitting now about whether this is actually their best shot at making it to Worlds, rather than, you know, developing an actual infrastructure for North American talent to develop. Because no matter who you bring in, they're going to be stuck within the bounds of the existing structure you already have for development. Whether they were already good or not, they will fall behind everyone else in the region that they were at, even if they're trying their very hardest, because the state of the talent development in this region is going to be what determines how well they themselves can develop. No one's a fucking god. They're not going to come in and create their own fucking environment, right? You can hire 60 Koreans right now and it's not going to do anything. It'll just create a seasonal server, and they aren't going to come in and suddenly be matched with 240 other players that will create the environment that they need to catch up to the Koreans over in Korea, or the Chinese in China, or the Europeans in Europe. That's just not going to happen, right? And if you think about any of these for like 5 seconds, it's obvious that it's all fucking bullshit, right? Like, they want the imports because the imports that they're going to bring in are people who everybody knows, and they can now sell ad space with them. The end.
Yeah, I mean, I just feel like it just doesn't really makes much sense. And like basically how youth development works in China. Because like, oh yeah, I just remember what I want to say. So I just think like the GM system, it just doesn't work in NA. So basically there are like 2 reasons. Like, first reason is there's not enough players, and then there's not enough players, and the teams don't have enough budget to sign every player they want. Because maybe there are like 5 good junglers, and you can't sign all 5, you know. Because maybe only yeah.
I can think of one team that would at least try to do that, and has tried to do that sort of thing in the past.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like for example, like, you know, if there are 5 good mid laners and 5 good top laners, you can't sign all 10 of them and put them in academy. At least in, like, you know, the West, I don't think it's financially
they
feasible.
Well, they had to put a rule in place so that you couldn't do that, because it actually was financially feasible for certain teams to do that, and they actually did try to do that. And so the orgs had to go to Riot and be like, you can't just let them do this. And they were like, I guess we can't.
I mean, if you pay them with the, like, you know, basic salary, I think it should be fine. Yeah. And the second thing is, like,
I mean, the players will, if they know they're not getting a starting spot, though, right?
Yeah.
But yeah,
of course.
So that's more the issue. But if the players don't know they're not getting a starting spot, and then they sign the contract.
Like, that's the thing. A lot of the players were actually unaware that they weren't going to be starting, or that it was actually so unlikely they would be starting. So they're willing to accept the salary because it's a big name organization. Like, of course, they're all going to be willing to accept. I've known a lot of players whose careers have just gone down the tube because they thought they were going to be starting. Turns out they weren't. They spent a year not playing, and now what the orgs have to go off of to determine whether they hire them or not, right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that should be an issue as well, because, you know, like the reason why you sign like 5 junglers is because you want to use one of the 5, and you, in the best
Sell
case
the
scenario,
others.
you sell the other 4. And
Exactly.
basically in
Yep.
China, how it works is like, hi, I have like 3 junglers for sale. So maybe I stay in like Shanghai, and if your team is like in Beijing, like before COVID, of course, I'll just send all 3 junglers there, and you can have them for a week and see how it goes, because that's how the trials work in China, and it doesn't
Yep.
matter. It doesn't matter like what type of player you are, unless you're like the top 10% of the players in the LPL. Otherwise, you have to go for a trial. If you're like a mid-tier jungler, like maybe you're like a top 10 jungler in China, you still have to go for a trial.
Yeah, we definitely don't have that in LCS either. But I
Yeah.
also think sometimes it's really like
No, like how much it's not expensive.
Well, I also hear like really weird tryout results, right? That are
Yeah, of
determining.
course.
Yeah, and then another thing is that LCS orgs, like if you're really interested in trying out a player who is under contract, like with another team, right? Then the LCS org is usually not really incentivized to even let you see their POVs or anything like that. So it's a very strange landscape, especially if it's like if you're a player and you have to try out for one team, but you don't have to try out for another team, and they'll just give you an offer right now, then you don't necessarily feel like you need to do a tryout. But in general, I think the scouting process can be way better.
Yeah,
in general,
of course.
yeah.
And also it's combined, like if you don't have
Yeah.
a trial period, and you have a GM making the roster decisions, then of course like 99% of the GMs have no idea what they're looking at.
Exactly.
So yeah, so that's why the roster review is gonna suck.
But that's by design. Like the orgs, by putting GMs in charge, aren't incompetent. They're just admitting that they don't actually care about knowing how good this guy is.
Yeah,
right. They don't actually care.
The only reason why this like GM system it works in China, if there are orgs who use that system, is just that I can sign all 5, so you just choose one.
There you go. I mean,
Yeah,
but yeah, and I mean in NA, I think like this is another thing, right, where more teams are looking at amateur, more LCS orgs are looking at amateur, so that they can, okay, we'll just sign all of the junglers, which is something that theoretically we almost kind of did on 100 Thieves, because we had Kenby and NXI at one point, and like basically just 2 of them, and then 1 was promoted to academy, so we had like 2 players in academy, and then we could have like 2 players in academy and 1 on amateur. So then at the end it was like, okay, well, we have all of our amateur players went to academy teams, but the thing that LCS orgs are now saying to Riot is that you aren't incentivizing us to get involved in amateur because you're limiting the contract period to 1 year. So we can't just sell these players after they play with us on amateur. So it's a really complicated situation. I personally think that contracts shouldn't be like 3-4 years, but I know in China they can be like 5 or more. So
I mean, in North America.
I mean, I think it's fine. Yeah, I mean, I think it's fine. As long as you have like certain clauses in place where you have to get paid like the certain amount of salary, or maybe if you haven't played like more than 50% of the matches, you can terminate your contract after like 1.5 years or 2 years, stuff like that.
In NA, we don't like. The thing is in NA we'll have the really long contracts, but we'll also not have clauses in them that protect players, right? So that they won't have those specific types
I mean, like Riot has to protect the players, or like the Players Association has to.
Yeah, but
protect the players, because the org is not going to do anything.
Joke. You're a comedian, Nelson. I love it.
The org is not going to do anything. So.
Yeah.
I mean, the Players Association literally exists so that when people ask about a players' union, people can be like, "Oh yeah, it's over there." And the thing that's owned by Riot and the organizations basically acts as a players' union. Literally, one of the people on the board of the Players Association is now an owner of one of the teams. Right? Like this is not anything close to the kind of thing that constitutes an actual unionization of players. And unionization of players is the only real way that you're going to start seeing these protections done properly, because it's just Riot and the orgs at the table, and they're just trying to keep a balance between what's going to keep the market viable or not. So if everybody just starts like cringing at them about the import rule and stuff, that could maybe make a difference. But feasibly speaking, if you create the players as like a third massive seat at the table, versus Riot and the orgs, rather than just in tandem with it right now, then maybe you can start seeing some changes, and probably even more so. But every single player is being told repeatedly that it's not worth doing it, because if you do this, Lord knows the orgs might start working together and all this stuff. And first off, I'm pretty sure it already happens. And second off, it's just ludicrous.
Like, this conversation allegedly between owners and Riot, if the argument is that, like, if the players start to organize and unionize, then the owners will also be able to do that, then the argument, it's like that they're already doing it, right? They're already talking about the import rule. They're already, like,
it will only happen in NA, you know. It will only happen in America, because, so let's say a similar situation happens in Korea, the best players will just go elsewhere. But if it happens in NA, there's nowhere the NA players can go.
Exactly, Like, it's, which is why...
This is the reason I don't like the import rule, though. Because where do the NA players go? Once you open up the floodgates and all of the imports come in, that's it. The NA players have no fucking job. And at that point, it doesn't fucking matter if the NA orgs can get together and put a salary cap. Because your salary is fucking 0 if they are allowed to get rules like this passed in. And they will keep trying. If they don't get it done this year, and I've seen people say that they don't think they might get it done this year, they will get it done in a few years' time. Right? It's not like fuck everybody is telling you that your salaries are at risk if you don't do it. Your fucking job and career is at risk if you don't fucking do it. Right? Like, that's way worse.
And there are already, like, allegedly illegal handshake agreements about player salaries where some orgs, and I've heard rumors of this happening in both LCS and LEC, where, like, and I don't know the legality in LEC, so I can't comment on that, but where orgs are saying, okay, we won't go above this number for this player. And they don't always, work, but if just talking about them or, like, trying to get an agreement like that is allegedly illegal, right? So if that's the thing that, like, a lot of lawyers in the industry are telling players, like, players unions will allow this to happen, I mean, great. I mean, the only thing as a player that you're...
It's not an argument that lives in reality.
But
the other reality of the situation is that if you want a players' union to occur, we're going to also have to start talking about the conditions that players are under right now, right? Because North America was the place where every single time that we went to Worlds, right, you would find that North Americans have to adjust to everybody else's 1 BO5 a day schedule, because these guys were doing legit like 3 BO3s a day starting at like 10 a.m. and stuff. If this is the kind of stuff that you are doing day in, day out, then of course no one's going to organize a players' union at that point, right? No one even has the fucking time to do this sort of shit, right? The conditions in North America, this isn't even just like a league thing, right? Because a lot of people watching this would be like, well, that seems like a bit conspiratorial, right? No, this is a well-studied phenomena throughout pretty much every aspect of North American work life. That the hours are so fucking much that unionization is somewhat unfeasible in a lot of different facets, right? Like, there's a lot of things going on here that people aren't necessarily aware of because they've spent their whole lives in video games, right? Rather than the real world. The real world's realities are creeping in right now, because you're seeing what happens when unionization never occurred, massive pressures haven't actually occurred, and the owners and the makers of the game, like, this is a very unique sport in that the makers of the game essentially still own the entire fucking sport, right? When they are just allowed to, no pun intended, just run riot with everything, right? Like, and people have to start talking about unionization as an actual viable solution to this, because it is the only viable solution to this right now. You have no voice if you don't do it. The owners are never going to play nice, right? They're never going to do it. The Reddit threads will go away. All right. The next Richard. Oh, I can't say that. The next guy will get banned who talks about stuff like this, right? Like it's like, this will not go away. Like, you guys are the only fucking voice that you can have.
I mean, this is the thing is, because I'm not a lawyer, right? I'm not a person who can give legal advice or who has studied this law enough, so I can't necessarily comment on how good a players' union would be. But I can say the only voices that I hear about players' unions or talk about players' unions that do have law degrees are lawyers for teams and people who work for Riot for the Players Association. So, like, my advice is generally get another opinion, Like, maybe a players' union can be something you can explore way more, because if your main concern, again, is the salary cap issue, here's also another thing. Riot, unless the import rule is lifted, LCS team owners are not necessarily in favor of the salary caps, because right now, what do they have to offer players from LCK and LEC other than money? if that's one thing that. So I'm pretty sure that they don't want the salary cap because then they can't hire these players.
I can give you a counterpoint.
If they have this, they're thinking that maybe they can institute a salary cap if the import rule is lifted. Because if the import rule is lifted, then maybe you can say, oh, if you come here as Damwon, you get to still play with your teammates, you get to have really cool LA food, and and maybe you'll come here for less money, you know? I don't know, like something like this. And then maybe you have a chance to be more competitive as well because you're coming here with your full team. So, yeah.
I mean, this is another thing. Like, there's an idea that you guys brought up way earlier that European players are going to be the predominant ones that are imported. I was asked recently by a PhD student who's doing his thesis on all this what I think stability looks like in the North American scene, right? What like a stable franchise infrastructure looks like. I genuinely believe that what's going to happen is you're going to have like a top 4 teams, organizations that have figured out that the way to make money is buyouts, right? And if you realize what the first team that figured out the way to make money here as buyouts was, maybe you'll find out which team I was phantomly talking about earlier. And you're going to have a bottom set of organizations that are constantly going to be trying something and then selling to another org, and then selling to another org, and then selling to another org. Because when was the last massive raise in buyouts, right? It was the Vulcan freeway trade, right? And 2 of the organizations participating in that trade were actually new organizations, e.g. under new management coming in, Dig under new management coming in, right? These were new organizations coming in, and because of their lack of knowledge of the market, the prices were immediately bumped up for buyouts, right? And these guys were also fresh investments, so they have fresh money to be pumping in. And I think that's genuinely what the future looks like. You're going to have like a 2 to 3 year rotation of these new organizations coming in and the top strata of organizations constantly making profit off of them. Given this, what's stopping one of the newer organizations coming in being like, we don't like any of the players that we have, which very frequently happens. You've had straight 5-man roster reshuffles even this year, and saying, fuck it, LMQ V2. Fuck it, all of Damwon might be available, or at least Damwon's like off-brand cousin might be available, right? Why not just bring in 5 Koreans at that point if you lift this import rule, right? Like, why not try to go for the Korean market?
I don't think it would work because the Korean market knows what the buyout prices are for the LPL.
Mm-hmm.
So unless you have more money than the LPL, there's no way you can buy them. Because if they were for sale, like, so let's say Damwon was for sale and there was no import rule, the only reason why they would go into NA is they wouldn't, because they don't want to go to China.
To clarify the joke, that's why I said Damwon's like off-brand tribute band, right? Like you wouldn't be going for 5 top-tier Koreans. You would be going for what LMQ actually was, which was they were tier 2, tier 3 Chinese players who came in and, you know, they shat all over the North American scene at the time. But you're probably going to be looking at more stuff like that. You're looking for August Koreans, not necessarily August, but like tier 2, tier 3 Koreans. You're looking for tier 2, tier 3 Chinese players that the LPL teams aren't going to outbid you for, that aren't even looking to outbid you for. But what they do give you is access to the China market. And access to the China market is a massive thing. A large reason why football teams wanted to come into league in the first place was so that they could increase access to the China market itself. You guys are what all the Western organizations are looking at, which is why when Korea opened itself up for franchising, you heard big names like FaZe trying to get in because it's one step closer to the market everyone wants to go to, right? But like nothing's stopping them doing this if we end up with these 2 to 3 year cycles of orgs fucking off and selling to another.
I did hear that about football teams, but I do think a lot of Western football teams, like depending on the football team, have more massive fan bases in China for football than they will have for league. But I think
it depends.
It depends.
It dramatically depends.
It depends.
Basically, the teams which are in league now, they're all like bad football teams. So
exactly.
They wouldn't have
it's kind of like it's kind of like the colleges that have the best league programs are shit universities because they don't have other things to attract players to attract people to their school. But
But it's like what Veteran was saying previously. I mean, that was what I heard when I was in China during Worlds as well.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, like the NA teams were around and they wanted to look for like the tier. I would say like tier 3 Chinese players, because even like players you consider tier 2, they are paid probably more.
Yeah.
But like the tier 3, tier 4 Chinese players, obviously they would earn more in NA. Playing even in academy, they would earn more.
And the other thing about I think China too is and obviously The salary cap is weird because there are a lot of exceptions and unpublished information on exceptions like foreign players, right? So, but there's still, in general, like there's clear exceptions in the salary cap contract or the salary cap information that at least is published that says that foreign players can have salaries that exceed the salary cap because they want to have like famous people coming in specifically for that reason. So in that sense, like you will still have competition from China on really, really famous Korean names, just not necessarily like you'll probably be able to outbid LPL teams on some players like Sword, right? Or players that are still like really, really well respected and really, really good, but not necessarily like huge as big brand value as like the big carries from Korea, So
I mean, like probably the salary cap affected, like Sora's decision to move from LPL, because from like at least like from what I know, it's just it only affects like the newer contracts. So and he ran out of his current deal ran out, or his deal previously shooting ran out. So, but otherwise, I don't think like you'll see like really any top players, especially in the more important roles, So like mid top 80, like they wouldn't go to other regions.
So long as international competition for these big names exists, North America doesn't really have an incentive to do a salary cap at like such a low level that players would significantly be losing out, because if they did that, they can't outbid China anymore. Right. So no matter what, I think it's really overblown on that. Even if it wasn't overblown, it's better to have that situation and you can still actually have a fucking career as a North American player than it is to have the alternative anyway.
I think in general, like the main point here though is that if you want to consider collective bargaining, there's not a lot of people talking about the benefits it gives you other than, avoiding a salary cap. Which I think right now there are a lot, if you're talking about what's in your contract. Make sure you know what's in your contract. It's almost unheard of to be able to bargain for stuff like more than a guaranteed month of salary. Just because no other players do it. But if you had a collective voice, then yeah.
Aren't the contracts guaranteed?
No, they are not.
Not all of them, no. It's case-by-case basis.
Most of them are not guaranteed. Even the ones that you think are guaranteed or that you have heard in the media are guaranteed, they're not. We don't really have.
Or if they are guaranteed, they're guaranteed to like the next 3 months' salary, for example. I remember one, like the Huni one was being brought up as a guaranteed contract, was actually only guaranteed for a specific, very tiny time period where it basically didn't matter.
Yeah.
Guaranteed as in like the org cannot terminate you and not
without
pay you
paying
if
out.
you didn't.
Yeah, but what
if you didn't sign anything, So like for example, the org just told you in January that they're gonna fire you, but you didn't sign anything until let's say March, so they still have to pay you until March.
Oh, okay. I don't know about that specifically. I'm talking about, to clarify for anyone in the audience, when I'm talking about guaranteed contracts, I'm talking about it in the sense of if we fire you, we have to pay out the rest of your contract. There are some agents that offer that as a specific service right now, and I think it's something that should be standard. And if a player's going to happen, it should be standard. So when the Huni, like, what was it that he was being paid for? It's like 2.4 million a month, some ludicrous number like that thing came out. What also came out was that it was a guaranteed contract, and people figured they'd have to pay out all of the millions, right?
Yeah.
When that wasn't really the case. Because guaranteed contracts don't necessarily mean the entirety of your contract.
But like being able to bargain for things like that, or I don't necessarily being able to bargain for things like that, being able to bargain for what Nelson mentioned, which was actual, stage time. If I don't get stage time, then I should get a certain amount of incentive, or being able to say I want an actual voice at the table when owners and Riot come together, like to talk about things like the import rule. Being able to bargain for things like that, I think, end up being a really big issue that we're kind of just ignoring because we're either not informed with the full picture of what a players' union can offer, or because we're scared when people mention that our salaries will go down. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's been the line that's being driven into people's heads by many org owners, and everyone has someone coming in mind when I say that right now, right? Like, and if you're a player, you don't have that much time to invest in actually acquiring the knowledge on how you would set all of this up. This is just going to add to your lack of motivation even to do that in the first place, right? Like, these guys don't really have time to do it. Like, who are we expecting to do it at that point? So, with this kind of misinformation ends up really dramatically affecting the odds of this thing ever happening in the first place, because the odds of it happening already are so fucking fine.
I mean, I think in EU the contracts are guaranteed, at least in Germany.
As far as I know, that has to be negotiated on a case-by-case basis. I've worked with a lot of players on that specific thing as well. So if they are, then there's an area of German law that the lawyers I've been looking at really need to inform me on. But
at least that's what I heard from one of the players in LC. So not really sure.
Some of
I mean,
them
maybe guaranteed by your
maybe have it,
definition. I forget that we're going by different ones.
Yeah. But I mean, even by your definition in NA, that doesn't really exist. So.
By my definition, they're not guaranteed. But my definition is a lot cooler than his definition. So.
Your definition involves more money, so.
Oh, of course. That's why it's so cool.
Actually,
having money is cool. That's why these owners have spent so long bullshitting people 24/7 and not being called out on it, because they have money.
Actually, Nelson, can you repeat what you said about your definition? Because I actually wasn't completely clear on it. So I just want to, like, when I say guaranteed contract, like, what do you mean by that?
Probably things like they can't just randomly terminate you, and then if they terminate you, then they have to pay, like, how much they owe you.
How much would they owe you be?
Like for example, if they told you like they're going to terminate you in January, but you didn't sign anything until March, then they have to pay like until March,
Okay. So
they have to pay from when the contract begins until the time in which they fired you, even if you hadn't signed anything for months, right? Because sometimes contracts will start months before you actually sign it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you just mean that if they haven't signed it, but what if they had signed it? Can they still be?
No, if they hadn't signed like the termination.
Oh, okay, sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But if you don't.
But this also implies that payment is delayed a lot in China, or am I wrong?
No, there isn't an issue in China, at least. Like you get what you're owed, or at least the league will help you get what you're owed. So
sure.
It's more like well protected there, I think. I think like the players are paid enough to get their own lawyers there.
Yeah, I know literally nothing about China. So.
You'd think players in NA would be paid enough to get their own lawyers, but not all of them do. So yeah. So but I think
and it's really strict in China anyway. So
yeah.
Like the league will review the contracts, and you can't have like some insane clauses which you're not supposed to have. So basically, they try to standardize most of the terms.
Yeah, I would say that like a lot of the terms in NA contracts are standardized, but it's mostly because a lot of the teams use similar lawyers or lawyer groups. So that's more the reason why, But I think that like there are things that Riot stipulates that you have to have, like minimum salaries, things like that. But a lot of the other terms are not really that. Like Riot doesn't have that many terms that teams have to subscribe to. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's up to the players to set that.
Anyway, this has been a pretty interesting conversation overall. I think before we finish up, though, I want to hear everyone's opinion on if you have on what you think of the import rule discussion, just sort of in brief.
I mean, I think it should be removed, but only for the players from the minor regions and for every region, so that it's fair. But other than that, I don't think it should be removed, because I mean, I probably don't want to see some random LCK team. I don't want to see KT just go to NA and win everything and still do nothing at Worlds, stuff like that.
Remove import restrictions for the ERLs, because it helps the development of the ERL players and helps their opportunities to get higher up in the league. Maybe remove import restrictions for Russia and Turkey for Europe if you're going to remove them from Oceania for North America, because that seems really arbitrary at that point. Though obviously the Russian ecosystem itself and Turkish ecosystem itself I'm not quite clear on, so maybe it would be a bad idea specifically for those regions, but I think it would be a good idea for the players overall. And fuck all the North American owners who think it would unironically be a good idea and are just lying to their fans about the reason why it would be a good idea to remove import restrictions. You're all bastards.
So
yeah, unironically, like holy shit, I'm disgusted every time I hear them talk. Go on.
I think so. In my opinion, I think there is a huge correlation between what happened in China and what happened in Europe in terms of them being able to have a development scene and be like less reliant on importing at the same time. And a lot of that was because they ran out of money in some way or the other, or at least had much less of it at the time. And especially for certain teams, like China has so many teams that you can't all just import and pay your players a lot of money. I remember very famously that RNG team in 2017 when Mata and Looper left. I would talk to people and they would say, no, you should stop trying to hype up this team. They're only doing this because they have no money, stuff like that. And that team went on to be like extremely competitive. Like people behind the scenes didn't necessarily have really huge expectations of how well RNG will do. I'm sure some people who watch scrims may have had different opinions, but in general, I think it was this, like people just didn't have faith in their player bases until they were sort of forced to, even in China and Europe. So I think that this year can kind of give us a litmus test of where we can go. So the notion of we have to rely on imports doesn't make sense. In addition, I think the import rule, the situation that we've gotten into as a result of the residency requirement is very difficult for NA. Because even if the import rule is not restricted, we'll still end up in a situation where we're going to have a ton of residents in the next several years, especially if you think that like the new administration coming in, everything else related to that. Maybe a controversial topic there, but I think
the better teams are just going to be like full of imports anyways.
Yeah.
Just because they have a bigger player pool to choose from.
Yeah, the bigger teams are going to be full of residents, right? So in NA, I mean, the rule as it exists is difficult to argue for, but I think in general, like if we keep this rule, but also have the lower tier teams investing in talent, then we should be able to see a better spread of domestic talent versus imported talent, especially since I think, again, we are seeing a lot of teams forced to invest in talent, so we can see how far that will go. Okay. Thank you guys for joining me. I think this was a fun conversation. I definitely learned stuff about Europe and China that I didn't know. So I'll release this pod tomorrow. Have a good night.
Okay, sure. Good night.
All right, guys.